This is Lily Mae. She was a blues singer, also known as Ma Rainey II, and I'm just going to tell you a little story about her. You see, one evening following the show, Lily Mae was approached by a young woman in a tattered, dirty dress with a busted lip. And Lily Mae asked her, "What can I do for you?" And she could tell that the lady had been crying because of the makeup streaming down her face. And the shy young woman just mumbled through a handkerchief that her boyfriend had been beating her and had now taken to stealing her money for whiskey. So, of course, Lily Mae was like, "We can't have that. Come to my dressing room. And I promise you, we're going to fix him and put a root on him so bad that not only will he leave town, but he's not going to hurt anybody else." And left the girl telling her that she should bring with her the next time she comes a sock from the young man, and she was going to fix everything. So the girl ran off into the night, joyful. It's like, "Thank you, Lily Mae. Thank you. I'll be back." 2 nights later, the girl came back, and Lily Mae could see from the stage this familiar face, and the girl started waving this sock. Lily Mae once again led her back to her dressing room. And there she poured "Do As I Say" oil on the sock and gave the girl and wrote the man's name on it and gave the girl the instructions that she was to take it to a creek. And from there, as it floated away, so too with the man, and she would never have to worry about him again. The next week, a similar looking woman came into the club, and she was the young woman's sister. And you see, her sister had nearly drowned herself while trying to do as Lily Mae said. And she didn't believe in any of this hoodoo mumbo jumbo and wanted Lily Mae to stop all this nonsense. Lily Mae, of course, as you can see, was probably not a woman to be trifled with, didn't like to be threatened, but also thought that perhaps beating up your client's sister was not the best bet for business. So she just sent her off in a huff with words that a Christian woman should not say. And that was the end of that chapter. Until about 3 weeks later, when a waitress from a fellow Beale Street juke joint came in, and she was like, "Ma Rainey, they told me that you got power. They said that you put a root on this man that was beating this girl, and he left town the very next day. So I need your help." So I tell you this story because if you go down to Memphis, Tennessee, and to any one of the curios shops on Beale Street, they will tell you that yes, there really was a Lily Mae who had power to put on roots on people and to drive trifling men out of town. But the unfortunate thing is that we don't often see these stories in music or television or even in the films that we see. I'm a little switched up. So, what I'm going to do today, we're going to discover today the persona of the conjure woman, who is often described as having two heads or examining two worlds. On the one hand, she brings the supernatural to the ordinary by acting as a guide to the spirit world, but also lives in the flesh by embracing the body through dance or sex. She lives apart as part of the community, but often can be away from the community because she is touched by the other world, whether by choice or by being just disowned by her community, which has often led to a degree of independence and freedom. But before all of that, I just want to announce I am Tyra, mistress of the Imaginarium, and I like to do YouTube videos about horror, fantasy, and all that jazz. So as you come with me, just throw a little salt over your shoulder, keep your mojo bag close, and we'll just crack in. So stories of magical women have been known, also known as conjure tales, have trickled down into the lyrics of the Delta blues. Now, the blues has often acted as a form of oral history, and it's here where you'll find the clearest description of conjure materials like John the Conqueror root and mojo bags. And in turn, the same life struggles that could be healed through roots and spirit intervention could also inspire the tunes of blues musicians. Conjure is usually associated with men when it comes to the blues, especially with motifs of freedom and sexual prowess. With the most famous conjure story being that of Robert Johnson and his deal with the devil at the crossroads in order to gain musical talent and fame. And here's an artistic rendition of him. But it was blues women like Lily May and the pictured here legendary Coco Taylor, who not only practiced hoodoo, but also took on the persona of the conjure woman while on stage. Which makes sense because both conjurers and blues women occupied similar complex social status within the Black community. These women were considered very immoral and dangerous because of their excesses and celebration of bodily pleasure. And they're reveling and bragging about their prowess with their many lovers, soon some of whom were even women. Other themes included advice to women, drinking, partying, heartache, jail and serving time, and even vengeance. All these things could also be remedied with conjure through performing a spell, a trick, or a mojo bag. The Conjure Woman was a 1926 silent film by Black film pioneer Oscar Micheaux and was based on a short story collection of the same name. Now, unfortunately, the film has been lost to history, but it tells of Peggy, who was known as a renowned conjure woman in her own community. And Peggy was also known in the story as for having uncanny abilities and could fly by the air at night. Voodoo would continue to be featured in horror movies of old Hollywood. However, the practice was nearly always featured as something innately evil, with Black characters never taking center stage and being pushed to the margins as either servants or tribespeople. That is until the 70s and the introduction of Blaxploitation horror. One of my favorite movies of this era is Scream, Blackula Scream, which is the sequel to the 1972 movie Blackula. Now, in the film, after a dying voodoo queen named Mama Loa chooses as her successor her adopted daughter Lisa, played by Pam Grier, who you can see right here, her son Willis, who feels he is the true heir, decides to raise Blackula from the dead because he was defeated in the aforementioned movie in order to get revenge. And of course, this basically goes as well as you think it does because the first thing Blackula does when he's raised is makes Willis a vampire so that he can be his minion. And then after hearing about Lisa and what she could do, goes to find her so that she can then take the vampiric curse off of him. But Lisa is also one of my favorite horror movie heroines. I love how director Bob Killian goes out of his way to depict Lisa as elegant, regal, intelligent, and thoroughly middle class. She even meets Blackula at a cocktail party given by African studies professor who's there to showcase jewelry. And she's surrounded by friends who are also middle class and have professional jobs. These are people who are not just Black and proud, but they're thriving in their environment. Lisa is also patterned very much in the vein of Mina Harker from Dracula and nearly hits every single beat of that story. She is soft hearted and caring for her friends and others, but is also very unsure of herself due to her status as an orphan, even though she was chosen by her coven members to be their leader. And so Lisa's journey is that of learning to embrace her role as voodoo queen and therefore embrace her own personal power. The film also takes place in the world of voodoo, in which different points of view are presented and thought out. For Blackula and the members of the coven, voodoo is seen as this healing force for good. For Willis, Mama Loa's son, it is seen only as a route to power. And for Lisa's boyfriend and his cop friends, voodoo is just some superstitious cult. As a rising queen, Lisa simultaneously represents Blackula's biggest help, and biggest threat. He needs her to end his vampiric curse, but at the same time, this is a power that can absolutely destroy him. And so in the climactic battle, who's been forced by Blackula back to his lair in order to perform this ritual that will free him. Meanwhile, her boyfriend Justin has rounded up the cavalry to save the day. And it's this dual action that makes it great in the scene. Unfortunately, I can't show it to you today, but if you ever get to check it out, you'll see that on the one side, you have a ritual being performed by Lisa, and you have all the accoutrement of voodoo there. You have dolls and candles and chanting, and there's even the hinted buildup of African drums. But on the other hand, you're put in the same shoes as Lisa and Blackula. With the mixture of, as the slow pace ramps up, you have a mixture of Dutch angles and extreme close-ups. And so as then it leads to quick editing cuts and it lends to a sense of tension and urgency. You could almost feel that Justin is about to burst his way in as things come about. And eventually he does. And when the ritual is interrupted by Lisa's boyfriend, he's attacked by angry Blackula. And so Lisa, having to see the person that she loves most attacked, now takes her final step towards power by protecting her boyfriend and destroying Blackula herself. Even though horror was big business in the 80s, when it comes to how voodoo was depicted, there seems to be a reversion of sorts. Voodoo once again falls under the umbrella of dark magic only, and it's a move that can be seen in Angel Heart's Epiphany Proudfoot, as seen here played by Lisa Bonet. Now, set in the 1950s, it is a classic devil at the crossroads story with a noir twist. In this world, though, voodoo is dark, dangerous, and is closely aligned with the devil. Epiphany herself is mainly used in service of the plot, in spite of her being a voodoo priestess herself. Her story just is there to lend to the gut punch that is the protagonist's final fate, living up to her name Epiphany, which also means a revelation or a lighting up of an idea. A film that gives a little more nuance to this story, to the world of voodoo of this era for me, is The Serpent and the Rainbow. Set in a time during political unrest, Dennis Allen, played by Bill Pullman, as seen here, has traveled to Haiti in order to investigate the story of a man who was allegedly turned into a zombie. Now, even though the film focuses on Bill Pullman's character, as seen right here, he is assisted by Marielle Deschamps, who is a medical doctor in her own right, and it's pictured right here as well. Though it's not made completely clear in the film, it's implied that Marielle wants to stop the fear being spread by the secret police and their use of zombification to intimidate those that would oppose them. Voodoo is deeply entrenched in Haiti's culture and religion, not only in the film, but as in real life. A zombie is to them, a zombie is equivalent to eternal suffering and pain as a spiritual slave. And to Marielle, by revealing the formula just to be a matter of science rather than spirit, she hopes to free her people from the emotional slavery that they're now stuck in. Marielle is also a devotee of Azila Frida, the Haitian voodoo manifestation of the goddess of love, beauty, and femininity. Her interaction with Dennis is very much like that of Beatrice from Dante's Divine Comedy, who also represents religious knowledge, passion, and grace. And so it's these two selves that are connected in which Mariel embodies. She, on the one hand, when she starts to become Dennis's lover, and then guides him on the quest to finding the formula for zombification. So you have this dual personality within Marielle in which she is lover and guide, and then is the very key to leading the way to the priest responsible for all the horror that's occurring, but is awkwardly sidelined because 80s, just so that Dennis can become the hero. The 90s brought about a revival of independent filmmaking, paving the way for new Black female creators to tell nuanced stories that centered around Black characters and placed them now back center stage, creating them with a range of depth. But the new 90s would also bring, mid 90s would also bring around the trend of Southern Gothic movies with stories taking place in the American South rooted in folklore, suspense, and the supernatural, starting with Daughters of the Dust, and then my personal favorite again, Eve's Bayou. Eve's Bayou is told from the perspective of the young protagonist, played by Journey Smollett. It centers on a seemingly perfect middle class family during the 1950s who are also Creole, and takes place during the summer in which Eve comes into her own psychic gifts as well as her own maturity as a woman, opening her eyes to the world and losing the rose colored glasses that we often see the world as children with. When we're young, we always think that the sky is blue and that our parents are perfect, loving and happy. But as the sweltering summer draws on, her gift literally grants Eve the new eyes in which to see all the complexities, faults, and insecurities, and even the humanity of all the adults around her. This is the first step as Eve steps into womanhood, to seeing the world through not only the eyes of an adult, but also the woman who would always see too much. Numerous contemporary examples like True Blood and American Horror Stories Govern have to varying degrees used voodoo and conjure to explore heritage, female empowerment, and dissect harmful stereotypes altogether. But it's in Beyonce's visual albums, Lemonade and Black is King, that we gain a different perspective. Beyonce used folklore along with various traditions of the Gullah and Creole peoples to explore the emotional journeys of grief, reconciliation, and Black identity through music, lyrics, visuals, and poetry. And it's her embodiment of Oshun in of the Yoruba goddesses Oshun in Lemonade and Imanya in Black is King. They can also be read as Beyonce's own story from one of generational curse breaking and inner healing to be able to guide others on that journey. But for me, the character whose journey reflects the most of the Conjure Woman arguably could be Bilquis of American Gods. Now, when we first meet Bilquis, we see her devouring a man through sex, during sex through her vagina, in one very unforgettable sex scene, and is also known as a demon. But as we learn her story, we learn that not only was she worshipped as a queen who had the ability to embody ecstasy and sensuality, but was a primordial goddess whose true power derived from the waters of creation. She had only forgotten herself and needed to be reminded of it. We should all want to be conjure women. Much like the various characters we've explored this afternoon, she has evolved from communal healer to being demonized, overlooked, or forgotten, to now being a path working for modern Black women to transform through healing and embodying their own sexuality. A conjure woman is a woman of power that commands respect, and as artists are able to create human portraits of Black femininity and culture through the lens of this archetype, their ability to do so in a mainstream way not only allows for Hollywood, albeit slowly, to embrace more of a representative portrayal, but also allows audiences from around the globe to bask in their glory. And so, thank you for listening. I'm Tyra, Mistress of the Imaginarium, and it has been my pleasure to speak to y'all today. You can also find me on the web on my website on Projector Imaginarium. You can find me on Instagram under Mistress of the Imaginarium and also on YouTube under Mistress of the Imaginarium. And thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much. That was amazing, and I'm gonna end up touching on some of the same movies you talked about, but hopefully in a different way. But yeah, I'd like to thank everyone at Final Girls Berlin and also my fellow speakers. This is such an amazing event, and I'm so honored to be a part of it. And I'm actually going to be speaking on the subject and title of the festival, The Final Girl. I'm going to be talking about some of the socio-political repercussions of this trope becoming so mainstream in horror, and also talking about some of the racial pitfalls of it. So without further ado, so the idea of the final girl was first coined by author Carol Clover in her foundational 1992 text, Men, Women, and Chainsaws, which I'm sure many of the people present here today are very familiar with. And since that publication, the term and theory behind final girls has only become increasingly embraced, discussed, and sometimes derided within the horror community. We can all easily point to the Laurie Strodes, the Ellen Ripleys, the Sidney Prescotts of the genre and understand that these women belong to a very particular group of horror icons. They're women whose strength we aspire to, whose struggles we might relate to. And particularly when it comes to older horror films, especially of the 70s and 80s, these were some of the few true depictions of female protagonists who could wield true power. So, in the most basic of terms, a final girl is the female protagonist of a horror film who acts as its sole survivor. She is the character who, by any means necessary, either kills the attacker herself, like in Slumber Party Massacre, or escapes them, like in Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And through her resourcefulness and drive to live, she alone earns this climactic confrontation scene between herself and the killer, where she literally stares death in the face. And is the only one who lives to tell that tale. And this is a still from Slumber Party Massacre, that climactic confrontational scene. And in this specific framework that was first isolated by Clover, the final girl is most readily found in the slasher subgenre of horror. And she's shown to exhibit a far greater drive to fight back and a far deeper will to survive than her peers. She's sexually unattainable, a fact which is often highlighted by contrasting her presence with that of a hypersexual friend who always dies, i.e., that trope, the slut dies first. And the strength she exhibits is often represented with very subtle masculine coding, with many final girls dressing less feminine than their counterparts and sporting gender neutral names, such as Ripley or Sydney or Jess. So the violence with which the final girl escapes usually occurs in a location that is previously thought to be safe, like a suburb or a summer camp or a school. And the vanquishing of that threat, after the vanquishing of that threat, that place again returns to this sleepy normalcy from which it began. So though the final girl throughout the film is usually represented as a very asexual figure, you can, yeah, thank you. Her method of defense against her attacker, at least according to Clover's original framework, is dripping with this sexual language. The weapons a final girl defends herself with are always phallic in nature, i.e., a knife, a la Laurie Strode in Halloween, or a chainsaw, a la Stretch in Texas Chainsaw Massacre Part 2. So rather than use sexuality as proof of the final girl's ascent into adulthood, the decidedly virginal final girl loses her innocence and becomes an adult at the moment when she instead penetrates her attacker with the phallic weapon, thus subverting this notion of virginity. So there are, of course, many deviations from this basic formula. Um, Thank you so much. And while the character trope began to form in the 1970s, it did not become solidly defined and repeatedly replicated and referenced until the 1980s. But most slasher films can be understood as either conforming, at least in part, to, or knowingly subverting the rules of the final girl, which I have laid out here. That her strength is masculinized in some way, that she is non sexual, that her survival is individual, that she is the only one standing at the end of the day, and that she is concerned only with her survival, and that her triumph will earn her peace at the end of her ordeal, at least until the sequel, that is. But this basic foundation of final girl theory completely falls apart when whiteness is removed from its formula. Black womanhood exists in a realm far beyond the colonial expectation of white femininity and fragility. And Black experience physically exists far beyond the confines of the contained white suburban sprawls that you would see in movies like Halloween or Nightmare on Elm Street, which are pictured here. And then can you go to the next slide for me? Thank you. The boom in 1980s slasher fare, which in turn propelled the final girl trope, was marked by the advent of Reaganism and the you're fine the reactionary conservatism that was born from it. The traditional setting of the final girl's narrative, that of the suburban neighborhood, was a place intentionally constructed to shut out Blackness. The innocence with which final girls began their narratives is a privilege Black women in horror are not afforded. The villains of Black horror films are symbolic of deeper societal trends of racism and misogynoir that are present before the introduction of the singular antagonist and continue far after their demise. So, if we are going to discuss the place of Black female survivors in horror, which, contrary to popular belief, there are many, we have to use an entirely different framework than what Clover provides us with in Men, Women, and Chainsaws. So instead, I'm turning to another foundational work of horror scholarship, which I encourage everyone to read if they haven't already. Robert Armin Coleman's 2011 book, Horror Noir, in which Coleman actually completely eschews the use of the term final girl, instead opting to refer to Black women who survived their horror films and lived to confront their antagonists as, quote, like, enduring women. So I'll be using some of the criteria she lays out in her research as a foundation and expanding a little bit further. So Coleman explains her choice to use the term enduring because Black final girls' stories lack the true finality that white final girls have. There is no peaceful return to that everyday suburban life. There is no waking up safely in the hospital bed far from the trauma of the events like Alice and Friday the 13th. Because Black women reside at this intersection of womanhood and Blackness and thus must contend with the double burden of misogynoir. They begin and end their films armed with this knowledge that, armed with the knowledge of what they must do to protect themselves and those around them. So in stark contrast to our white final girls, Black final girls, or enduring women as we might call them, can be understood using the following basic criteria, which is up now. Usually they're highly feminine and sexual. They are armed with this pre-existing wisdom and knowledge of the danger around them. They act as protectors of those around them, usually occupying a role as either a mother figure or an avenger. And the Black final girl survival is communal rather than individual. Oftentimes, she's not the only one to survive. She acts more as a leader, bringing others into this realm of survival with her to the end of the film. So I'm going to be focusing on 3 separate time periods in which Black final girls were most frequently found on our film screens. And I'm going to be focusing on 2 different examples from each time period. First, we're going to start with the 1970s, and then the resurgence of independent Black filmmaking in the 1990s and the early 2000s. And then I'm going to end with a discussion of the modern Black horror renaissance that we kind of currently find ourselves in. You can go to the next slide for me. Thank you so much. But before I begin, I do think it's important to ground any discussion of Black horror in the origins of the genre. It's important to understand that the very existence of Black horror as a subgenre was born out of rebellion and necessity. The earliest known Black horror director, which we heard about before, began creating and financing his films in response to the lack of Black horror films, Black stories, sorry, that were being produced in Hollywood, but also more specifically in response to the overwhelming success of the racist propaganda film Birth of a Nation in 1915, which incited anti Black violence across the American South. And these filmmakers who were producing in response to this understood film as one of the most powerful tools with which to propagandize, to titillate, to incite, and in the case of horror, to frighten a population. And these filmmakers understood that when you were dealing with a medium that is that powerful, representation isn't just important, it's absolutely crucial. Actually, so the earliest Black horror films with female protagonists that we have surviving today were often these short narratives that dealt with themes of religion. Most of these were not what we would consider to be fully fledged horror movies, but rather they're moral tales that use the imagery of hell or damnation, Christianity to frighten people. And almost all of these early films either deal with Christianity or voodoo or both. And it makes sense that the occult, and particularly voodoo films, were this initial subgenre vehicle that carried what we might consider to be the proto-Black final girl. Voodoo or voodoo, as you might also call it, in the American South, is a huge cultural and religious aspect of the Black diaspora. And it centers on inherited generational knowledge, matriarchal power, engaging with the past, and particularly community. So some of the earliest origins of what we can understand to be aspects of the Black final girl are found in this use of voodoo. And, yeah, thank you so much. So on to the 1970s. Black final girls reached their heyday a decade before white final girls would in the 1980s. And the 1970s were a singularly unique moment in American film history. The death of the old Hollywood system left this giant void that was filled by independent studios, first time filmmakers, and outside artists. In this new Hollywood landscape, as it's come to be known, Black creators were receiving this spotlight and funding that they had never had before. Smaller budgets were given to more numerous productions, and this meant that there was less interference from studios and more creative freedom. These cheaply made blaxploitation films were marketed directly to Black audiences and pulled their plots from the headlines of newspapers and the latest trends. And because they so perfectly reflected the current events, they required little to no advertising to draw interesting crowds. And they also expertly pinpoint the particular anxieties and tensions that weighed heavily on the demographics they were created for. So if we understand horror as the anthropological study of what scares a population, and exploitation film as a study of what easily captivates a population, then what we have in blaxploitation horror is this perfect storm of films that sought to directly target the most sensitive, intensive topics, and thus serve as the perfect vehicle with which to explore the eras in which they were created and released. So blaxploitation was not something that was readily embraced by the Black community. The term itself was actually coined by a member of the NAACP as a way to disparage the films and discourage others from buying tickets to them. And then these two images you see on the screen at the bottom are of a Black Panther Party protest against blaxploitation films. This was in San Francisco in 1972. And the Black Panther Party protested blaxploitation films due to their underpayment of their Black talent and their reliance on dangerous tropes, particularly surrounding women, which is completely valid. Despite the name, most blaxploitation films were written and directed by white men, with very few of them actually being created by Black people. So it is just, as a whole, a very successful marketing strategy. So, thank you so much. Oh, no, you're fine. Yeah. We heard a bit about Scream Blackula Scream in the last presentation, so I'm not going to get too deep into the plot again. But what I would like to draw attention to is this really unique characterization of Pam Grier's Lisa in the movie. Um, so on the right of your screen, you see a screenshot of Pam Grier as Lisa. And on the left, you see an image of Pam Grier in the movie Coffee, which was the film she was best known for at the time. And you see this very stark contrast in how she's depicted, how she's dressed, how she's styled. In Scream Blackula Scream, her entire wardrobe is very high necked, covered. Her hair is in this short, natural afro for the entire duration of the film. This is in stark contrast from most of the other blaxploitation films for what she was known, in which she was usually scantily clad. Often her hair was straightened. And this is something that was done entirely intentionally. She's intended to be a respectful representative of Black womanhood in Scream Blackula Scream. Um, and in this, we see this tension that's going to follow the rest of our final girls, and that tension is of respectability. Horror movies, even before the invention of film horror stories, have always used death and survival to moralize, with the good guys surviving and the evil being vanquished by the end of the story. So, thus, the survival of a protagonist can be seen as an endorsement of their behavior. And in an era where Black stories were just beginning to be told, and were still often in the hands of white directors and writers, every chance for a Black character to be seen on screen was an opportunity for a character to act as an ambassador for Blackness. Um, so when Black people did get their hands on control of these blaxploitation films, they often saw it as their duty to make sure that the characters were upholding standards that they wanted people to associate with Blackness. And in women, this often meant modesty. This could mean a maternal nature. Often it was things like this that contrasted with blaxploitation movies that were more exploitative and that were created by white people. You can get the next slide. So the second movie I'm going to be talking about in this 1970s section is Ganja and Hess. And it is one of my favorite films, and it's an absolutely essential entry into the canon of Black film and of Black final girls. The film was created by Bill Gunn and received studio funding in large part due to the success of Blackula, which was the first film that came before Scream Blackula Scream. And the studio's belief that the story which Gunn was crafting would be kind of in that same accessible high camp vein as Blackula and Scream Blackula Scream. But instead, Ganja and Hess is this truly cerebral, beautifully shot experimental meditation on Black assimilation, the Black church, sexuality, love, and addiction. The film was actually the sole American entry for the Critics' Week of the Cannes Film Festival in 1973. But despite this triumph, it was still pulled from distribution for fears that it was unmarketable due to its intellectual nature. So Ganja and Hess tells the story of Hess, a professor of anthropology, who is stabbed by his suicidal assistant Mita with this dagger artifact from an ancient tribe of African vampires. Hess ends up killing Mita in the ensuing struggle, but he becomes infected with vampirism himself and begins preying on local sex workers. And then when Mita's wife comes looking for him, she and Hess fall in love, and she eventually joins him in his vampirism. The act of their hunting is this decidedly sexual mixing of hunger with carnal desire. But eventually Hess rejects this, and when he tries to find a cure, and he does, he attempts to bring his new wife, Ganja, with him into death. Ganja, however, breaks with all filmic tradition, and she refuses Hess. And while he willingly does die, she remains this immortal being ensconced in their home, just enjoying the pitfalls and ecstasies of vampirism on her own. So unlike our other selfless final girls, who kind of live to serve others, live to protect their community, Ganja is this really refreshing and distinct example of selfishness. In one of the final shots of the film, we see this young man who is previously thought to have been killed by the pair rise up and begin running towards her, kind of hinting that although she loved Hess like she loved her husband, men are ultimately something that will always be replaceable for her. And this is such a radical stance for a movie to allow a Black woman to take, to allow her to entirely shirk all others in her life in favor of her own desires, both sexual and material. So Ganja is one of the seldom examples of Black final girls who end their films as individualistically as white final girls so often do. Um, so as groundbreaking and beautiful as this film was, it was actually lost for a very considerable amount of time. And in 1973, the director penned a very interesting op-ed in the New York Times that almost serves as a eulogy to all Black films that were forgotten, ignored, derided during this time. And in this op-ed, he says, quote, one white critic left my film, Ganja and Hess, after 20 minutes and reviewed the entire film. If I were white, I would probably be called fresh and different. If I were European, Ganja and Hess might be that little film you must see. Because I'm Black, I don't even deserve that pride that one American feels for another when he discovers that his fellow countryman's film has been selected as the only American film shown during the Critics' Week. Not one white critic from any of the major newspapers even mentioned it. So that is this unfortunate pitfall of Blaxploitation, is that because it was marketed for Black people, never really captured the attention of the mass media at the time. It was always considered something that was kind of lowbrow, something that was for others. So in the 80s, there was this sharp decline in Black representation within the horror genre. We kind of lose even that small window of 70s Blaxploitation. And this window of opportunity awarded by the tumultuous Hollywood system of the 70s just completely closes shut. And there is just a complete lack of very much presence, Black presence in 80s horror. And that doesn't really reopen again for independent Black creators until the 1990s, which we're going to skip ahead to as our second section. Thank you. So by the mid 90s, Black horror was having a resurgence. Something called the urban horror phenomenon was in full swing. And this particular era of horror was very focused on the lives of Black people in urban locations, particularly urban locations that were at the time being heavily demonized by the media. The crack epidemic was in full swing. And so you could turn on the news at any given point and hear fear mongering about cities like Baltimore or Detroit or New York, in which news anchors wanted the public to believe that these were places where, you know, humanity went to die, where Black people were just floundering with drugs. And so once again, Black filmmakers were attempting to control this narrative, to right these wrongs, and to tell authentic stories that spoke to their own humanity and their own experience. And one of the most recognizable Black final girls of this era, one of the most recognizable Black final girls in general, is Jada Pinkett Smith as Geraldine in Tales from the Crypt Presents Demon Knight, 1995. She's often misrepresented as the first Black final girl in history. But she's obviously not. But Geraldine is this recently incarcerated woman on work release who is serving as a housekeeper in a former church that has now been rebranded as a brothel and hotel in New Mexico. She's an interesting case study insofar that she no longer closely adheres to these tropes of hyper femininity that we saw in a lot of Black final girls of the 1970s. She kind of adheres more to these white final girl tropes of masculinity. She has this shaved, bleached head. She wears denim throughout the film. But despite this return to a more traditional final girl appearance, she still embodies this hardened wisdom that all Black final girls bring. She's harsh. She begrudgingly completes her work when she's assigned it, but she's bemoaning her situation the entire time. And when the film's action is spurred by the arrival of this immortal man who has been tasked with defending a key, which, if seized by these demons that are pursuing him, will result in the apocalypse. Yes, it is an insane plot. Um, she springs to action and she becomes this quick-witted leader with this absolutely iron will. So while her other companions in this hotel that has been surrounded by demons are being seduced by these promises and threats, she is one of the only ones who manages to stay strong. Um, um, yeah. Uh, in this climactic scene towards the end, the leader of the demons, known as the Collector, captures her and is attempting to seduce her into this sexual and romantic relationship with promises and with threats. And they actually do engage in this interesting dance where she silently allows him to spin her around as she watches in this kind of facade of meekness and submission, just silent. And this only lasts until she's close enough to attack him with her weapon of choice, which she's been hiding in her mouth, which is the reason for her silence and which enables her to escape. So we see this return to using that femininity that she doesn't have regularly throughout the movie, but that she employs as a weapon. And it's the key to her survival. And when the film ends, Geraldine kind of takes up becoming this immortal protector of this key. And thus she becomes this protector of all humanity. And as she boards a bus to leave New Mexico, we see a new Collector watching her and preparing to begin his infinite pursuit of her and the power she now controls. And it's interesting because while the act of becoming a protector can be read as an empowering one, and indeed she does find acceptance and purpose in her eventual role as a defender, it's important to note that this theme of self-sacrifice is so prevalent in the stories of Black women. And it is a reflection of this double burden Black women often experience, where they're expected to uphold they're expected to maintain strength of womanhood, strength of Blackness, and to be there for both of these communities constantly, to constantly be strong. And then can you go to the next slide? Thank you so much. And then second, in our 90s, early 2000s final girls, we have the film 28 Days Later, which came out in 2002. And this film follows Jim, a man who has just woken up from a coma in a hospital, only to discover that the country has been overrun by those infected with the virus, which turns them violent and nonsensical. He cluelessly wanders the empty streets of the city until he's saved by this pair of survivors, one of whom ends up being our final girl, Selena. And Selena and Jim eventually begin a friendship, which morphs into a relationship as they join up with fellow survivors, eventually arriving at a military base that has been transmitting radio signals promising them safety. And when the group arrives, it becomes clear that the soldiers intend to force any women they come across into sexual slavery in an effort to repopulate the country. Selena's introduction to this film is actually very interesting. It's anonymous and it's genderless. She initially appears just as this figure, completely covered from head to toe, when she rescues Jim from an oncoming group of the infected. Before we know her race or gender, what we first know about her is that she's highly capable, that she's knowledgeable of survival in this strange and violent new world. And later in the film, when her initial companion becomes infected, Selena unceremoniously kills him immediately without a second thought. So she closely adheres to this Black final girl / enduring woman idea of survivalism, of wisdom. And although she's not the sole survivor at the end of her film, she is a leader, and she ushers her chosen family of survivors to safety throughout the film, in turn defending them or being protected by them. So we see this idea of community. The formation of their chosen family is the formation of their chosen family is what protects them. It is what ends up protecting Selena, and it is what she's concerned with defending throughout the film. It's not just her life or herself. So Geraldine and Selena are both these more masculinized final girls who are both more concerned with those around them than just with their self-preservation, which is an interesting trend that comes around in the early 2000s. Um, so, could you get the next? Thank you. I'm going to end with talking about some of the what I'm going to, for the purposes of this talk, call contemporary Black horror, which I'll be just defining for now as anything that is post the release of Get Out in 2016. These are typically high-profile Black films that have received critical acclaim and scrutiny. Um, and they're coming out at an interesting time when Black horror is currently occupying a role in cinema more visible than it ever has before. Movies like Candyman or Us, shows like Lovecraft Country, that's no longer being treated as something that's other, something that is lesser, just because it's something that involves Black people and is created for Black people. So we are at very interesting crossroads. And I'm going to begin talking about this final girl who's, in fact, the only girl I'll be talking about today. That is Melanie in Girl with All the Gifts 2016. This is perhaps one of the most shockingly subversive films to feature a Black final girl. For starters, she's actually a child who's being held in this research facility in this post apocalyptic world. She belongs to a group of children who are the second generation to be exposed to a devastating virus, which causes the infected to crave human flesh. It's a zombie tale. But because Melanie and those like her were exposed before birth, they're only half turned. So they both possess this fervent desire for human flesh, but they also retain human thought and human emotion. And the researchers here are hoping to isolate a cure for the virus by experimenting on the children. When this breach results in Melanie and a researcher who kind of acts in turn as a surrogate parent, a protector, and also kind of a prison warden, results in them having to flee. Still, despite rejecting that world that this researcher hopes to preserve through her death, Melanie doesn't just end the film as this lone individual. Rather, she rallies the rest of the second generation infected children in pursuit of a world that will be ruled by their kind. She chooses to protect and align with another community. It's just a community of her choosing and of her creation. And it's this really profound characterization that really finally marries this typical trope where the Black woman or the Black girl is a communal protector with this idea that the Black woman or the Black girl also deserves autonomy. Also deserves to not have to lose herself in the protection of others, that both can exist at once. And thank you. And the last film I'm going to be talking about is 2021's Candyman sequel slash reboot. So the Candyman reboot slash sequel tells the story of a Black couple who is living in the now gentrified Cabrini Green. The man in the couple, Anthony, is a visual artist who is searching for inspiration for his work when he discovers the story of Candyman, who is the specter that is said to haunt Cabrini Green and is said to have done so for decades. And as the film progresses, he begins to show further and further erratic behavior until it becomes clear that he is being taken over by the spirit of Candyman. And the relationship between his girlfriend, Brianna, who ends up being our final girl, and Anthony is really interesting because it harkens back to a lot of tensions that were present in 1970s blaxploitation horror. Mainly this tension between Black masculinity and female power. Brianna has this successful art career. She has good financial standing, and this often makes Anthony feel very insecure about his own artistic career as it flounders and his art fails to capture the interest of majority white buyers and critics. And this is a movie that focuses on the cyclical nature of violence as it's exhibited on the Black male body. Each new incarnation of Candyman in this film is another man or another boy whose life has been violently stolen by either police brutality or by lynch mobs. And with each new generation, there is a new representative of Candyman who is reborn again and again and again. And he is kind of this liminal figure who persists as a guardian of Cabrini Green. And as the film unfolds, we start it kind of seeing everything through Anthony's eyes. But there's this really interesting transformation that happens where the gaze shifts from Anthony to Brianna. And eventually we are seeing his increasingly erratic behavior and his actions through the gaze of this Black woman who isn't privy to this mystical reasoning for his behavior. So she doesn't really know what's happening. And the moment Anthony fully loses his identity, the moment he transforms into Candyman, is when Brianna fully emerges as our protagonist and as our final girl. It's when the gaze fully shifts to her and we are fully immersed in what she is seeing. And at the end of the film, there's this really interesting moment where Candyman turns to her and his final words, which he speaks, are to Brianna. And he says, quote, tell everyone that I'm here, tell everyone that I'm back, tell everyone that I am a protector of this community, that I'm a protector of the Black people of this community. And we have this understanding that she is going to return to Cabrini Green with the knowledge of Candyman and spread the word that he's returned, spread the word that he is working as a protector for them. So we end the film with Brianna literally being tasked with carrying this knowledge, tasked with carrying the trauma of, hundreds of years of this tradition with her. And that's where some of the deep criticisms of this film recently have come out. Critique of Brianna's role in the film, that it relies too heavily on the exploitation of Black trauma and bodily violence. Because at the end of the film, it is her leaving the film carrying the trauma of Candyman, the trauma of her boyfriend with her. It is a Black woman who is carrying this baggage of male trauma and is expected to go on and is expected to act herself as a protector of the community by spreading the knowledge of what she's seen. Can you go to the next slide for me? Thank you. So finally, as I was researching this talk, I kept returning to this bell hooks theory of oppositional gaze. Because when I was rereading Men, Women, and Chainsaws, I kept coming up against this idea that final girls are meant to be this completely permeable avenue into horror, that men are supposed to be able to see themselves through final girls, that women are supposed to be able to see themselves through final girls, that everyone is supposed to be able to see themselves through them, and it is kind of a trope, and it's an identity, and it's a gaze that is supposed to transcend all identities and be universal. And I find fault with that because I think that the Black female gaze, Black female spectatorship is something that is so unique. It is something that is so layered. It is at the epicenter of so many intersectioning identities, so many intersectioning experiences. So when we collapse when we collapse final girls into just this category that is supposed to be a catch-all, when we pretend that race isn't something that factors into this, that race isn't something that matters in this, I think we're losing so much dimension and we're losing so much depth. Because when we choose to tell stories of Black women who are resisting, Black women who are surviving, we are getting such layered, such textured stories. And such different experiences that we wouldn't get before if we weren't really leaning into what experiences we're teasing out when we include race as an avenue of exploring horror. So, yeah, thank you. Yeah, you can find me on Instagram where I have writing, and you can also find my email if you have any questions. So, yeah, thank you.
Oh gosh, it's kind of hard to follow up all this brilliance. I thank you both so much. So many other avenues to research. I think I'm ever the student, so of course I've taken lots of notes. I'm Rhonda Jackson Garcia, and thank you all for coming here to our panel. I really appreciate the Final Girls Berlin team for having us. It's really a thing. The thing that strikes me is many events say that it is hard to be inclusive and to find, presenters who are diverse in nature and topic. And here we came all the way to Berlin. They managed to find 3. So, I mean, kudos to you for that. Thank you so much. So as I said, I'm Rhonda, and I want to talk a little bit about mothers, lovers, and others, where we'll examine Black female characters in a few select horror films. So this is based on a book that I am currently shopping. So I mean, publishers, documentary filmmakers, come holler at your girl. I have something for you. So for our conversation today, we'll first talk about the foundation of my analysis of these characters. We're talking about the goals, and then we'll take a look at some Black female characters as mothers, as lovers, and in other roles. And then we'll talk about the relevance of this analysis. So my foundation, basically, I am looking at the intersections of race and gender within the horror genre from an interdisciplinary approach. So I'm looking at film, literary, and cultural studies. And also, I'm going to talk about that idea of the oppositional gaze from Bell Hooks, as Adia introduced for us so wonderfully. Thank you. As in the idea that Black women are watching media in sort of an opposition because we don't always see ourselves reflected therein. Also want to work with the working definition of the male gaze as coined by Laura Mulvey, as the woman as an image, the man as bearer of the look, and then the very, very basic rudimentary understanding that Black feminine experiences are not a monolith. And so, there can be all kinds of experiences that really aren't always shown in cinema. So our conversation, well, this examination is kind of taking into consideration that there have been strides, right? We have made progress. We do see more Black female experiences in horror film. But I'd like to ultimately argue that first, because these experiences are nuanced, and it can be kind of horrific being a Black girl. Not that there isn't any joy, but this is horror. We're talking about a medium defined by making people uncomfortable, being horrific. That these Black female characters should be more nuanced, more multidimensional. And then secondly, that if we allow more own voices in the creation of horror, then we might get more of these multidimensional and nuanced characters. So, mothers. The bulk of a lot of my analysis comes from mothers, not just because I am a Black mother, but because I think that there is a lot to be left, a lot to be desired in how we examine motherhood experiences in film, especially in the horror genre. Adrienne Rich wrote basically the seminal tome on motherhood experiences of Woman Born. And even she admitted that there were some voids there in her research, in that mothers in the margin weren't very much included in her examination. And I can appreciate that as a scholar, also as a mother myself, because of course, reading these experiences, I'm thinking that doesn't sound like mine, right? So, first, we would want to talk about how ideas of mothers in a lot of horror cinema, they're based in, rooted in slavery, in the mammy caricature. All right, so this is a caricature that's based very, very tiny a bit in truth, but mostly in myth. And it perpetuates this idea of this Black woman who is very, very happy to take care of other people's kids and not her own, that she would be neglectful to her own family. And also these physical portrayals, she's often of a large stature, dark skin, and these go directly in the face of what the fact was. The fact is that many household domestics were actually fair-skinned. They were usually biracial, and they were also typically underfed. So they weren't happy and fat. They were usually pretty thin. And they were also usually sexually assaulted. Not, I shouldn't say usually. Many times they were also sexually assaulted, which kind of flies in the face of the idea that they're asexual, that nobody wants them, that there is no one wanting to overpower them or to sully them and violate them. So, and why is this important? Well, because when we look at some mothers in horror films, there are a couple of portrayals that actually subvert this, the idea of a mammy character. And I find that very fascinating. One of these is the character of Sue Ann in the 2019 film Ma. And so in the very first scene where we see Sue Ann, she's shown in proximity to one of the white teenagers that she befriends. So she seems safe. She has this really, mammy type hairstyle. She is a large woman. It seems that it's okay for them to approach her. And so they do so. And it seems like she's very harmless. I mean, you see her here in this still. She's got the white eyes. I mean, it's like, hey, she can't hurt anyone. Now, of course, we quickly realize that she does indeed hurt quite a few people. And she's actually the traumatized victim of the children who she's like trying to kill, their parents. And the thing that makes her very interesting as a character is that she is also a mother. And so she keeps her child drugged and locked in the house under the guise of telling the daughter that she's disabled. And so we see this character who's set up to be protecting of children who actually starts to give them alcohol, and she like tries to kill them and their parents, and she does all this harm to her own daughter. We can, of course, argue that maybe she's trying to protect her daughter from the same type of bullying that she endured. One of the big things throughout the movie is how she keeps her daughter from going to school. This is one of the ways she keeps her safe, so to speak. And so, but what's to love about this character? Well, first of all, she's like very vengeful. And I mean, I'm here for it. I mean, if we're going to be a monster, let's go all out. Like, she's indeed pretty monstrous. It also offers a picture of a middle-aged Black woman. And here's the thing, like now that I'm middle-aged, I hardly ever see middle-aged women who are not sacrificing themselves or who are not caring for everybody else. Sue Ann is like, man, look, it's over for everybody. And I think that it also offers this really refreshing viewpoint of criminality that stems from trauma. Now, of course, we can argue all day long. Yeah, no, she was just bad and that's just what it was. But she did experience trauma in high school. It's very possible that had this not happened to her, had she not been sexually assaulted, that she might have turned out to actually be a decent person. I mean, of course, it's up for argument, but, I like to dream, right? So she is this false mammy, which subverts this mammy trope. She uses her appearance as safe in order to lure the kids in. This kind of begins her whole vengeance plot. And so instead of leaning into being the nanny, she of course then turns into that whole fun-loving, hey, I'll give you alcohol, come to my house and party kind of person. And she also doesn't take very good care of her own daughter. Despite what her intentions may have been, the end result was that this is really bad. Another really, really intriguing view of Black motherhood, I think, was presented in Us from 2019. And so we have Red Adelaide and Adelaide Red, who give us two totally different depictions of Black motherhood and those experiences. And this duality is shown in one of the movie promo posters, which I thought was very, very stunning. Once I saw the movie, I thought, oh my gosh, this is how this actually did play out. There is an upper middle class Black family at the center of the horror, which is also a little bit different. I think that both of you kind of touched on that. Like that's a different kind of thing. They had money. They had like a vacation home. not just a home, but a vacation home. And they had generational wealth. They were deeded this house, so that was kind of different. But mostly I want to talk about those nuanced depictions of Black motherhood. And so Red Adelaide was a very devoted mother. Like, she loved her children and she literally protected them with her life, which is very interesting because she is the clone. And so theoretically, we would think that she would be the monstrous mother, right? But she turned out to be an actual loving mother. She also shows pity toward Adelaide Red's children as they were dying. She did not want them to die brutally, and she showed a lot of pity in trying to help them and ease that transition. And so this is a very positive view of Black motherhood without any pathology attached to it. Right. And some might say, I've seen critics kind of say, but she was obsessed with her children. And that's kind of different. And I'm thinking, have you met a Black mother, though? That tracks. So then Adelaide Red, though, shows us this whole other experience. She was forced into motherhood. And her introductory clip, which I'm sorry that I can't play, is where she talks about being forced to take her doppelganger's partner's doppelganger as a mate. She didn't want to breed with him. She didn't want to have those children. And so this is really important for Black mothers, especially those who are forced into motherhood, who may be victims of rape, who may be victims of incest, who may not have the money to afford birth control or health insurance or abortions. And so they're forced to have these children. Adelaide Red, she didn't even try to take care of the kids, really. She's like, they're monsters. I don't really like them anyway, and I don't really care that much what happens to them. One of the most poignant scenes in the movie was when Adelaide Red has Red Adelaide, like, kind of up against the ropes on that coffee table, and they hear one of the babies kind of start to whimper, scream, and then Red Adelaide says to her, I think that's yours. And then she kind of has to go, oh God, again. They always want stuff. So Adelaide Red is not the ideal mother. She subverts that mammy trope by just kind of being opposite of what a lot of moms can be. She's like, I'm not that community Black mama. I don't care about my kids. I really don't care about your kids either. Let's just kill all of them and that'll be great. Right? But yet she's being forced to care for those children, and that's what ultimately leads to her downfall. This is how she ends up being killed. It's because of that forced motherhood, that trap. I think it's really interesting how both of these characters, so Sue Ann and Red Adelaide, kind of generate some sympathy for Black mothers who have been victimized. Again, mothers in the margin don't always have that same motherhood experience that mothers who have a bit of privilege do. There's also the idea of understanding nuances. I know that being Southern, there's one idea that we have of Black motherhood, right? And that you're supposed to always be happy, you're supposed to always love your kids. Thank goodness that Adrienne Rich talked about this whole motherhood myth because it's not always a wonderful and great thing. You're not always happy. And I think that nuance is important. We need to show that outside of saying that Black mothers are pathological. So, Black women as lovers. Well, here we start venturing into that male gaze that Mulvey coined. Matamore says here that women's bodies are often sexualized in every aspect, and when women want to take control of their own sexuality, it's shunned and looked down upon. And this is one of the very real results of the male gaze, in that women are objectified, their sexuality is not their own, they don't really have agency to exercise that. One of my favorite depictions of a lover is Rita Vedder from the vampire in Brooklyn. This was supported by a predominantly black cast, and at the time, super megastar Angela Bassett was up and coming, and it also co-starred Eddie Murphy. So what's to love about Rita Vedder? Well, she was a detective. She was very powerful, and she actually had a pretty developed backstory. I mean, it was a little schlocky, right? A little cornball, but aren't all vampire movies? But for what it was, she had a pretty developed backstory. And she shows some realistic contradictions in a black female experience. So she embraced the supernatural aspects of religious faith or denial that vampires even existed in the first place. And again, coming at this from the lens of lived experiences of a Southern black woman, that's huge. That's a huge thing to be able to even acknowledge that. Her character shows a full range of emotions, and these are things we kind of take for granted in good storytelling, but black women characters aren't always afforded this range. She's also respected by the men who love her, and she's given a bit of agency in deciding whether or not she's going to be with her vampire lover. So again, she's not forced. He asks her if she wants to give this permission. But there's some not so great things about Rita Vedder's character. The main for me is being that she only exists in relation to the men in her life. So she doesn't get the option, as Ganja or Melanie did, that you mentioned here, that says that, okay, I can choose me. She has to choose one of them. She doesn't even get to. I was kind of hoping that she would just like stake the vampire and, chunk the deuces for the detective and say, I'm going to be a vampire and I'm going to run my own life. I'm just going to do this. I'm going to do all of this. And so she's not presented with that option, though. And that was a little bit disappointing. But I mean, I guess we can't have everything. And then there's Jen in Sweetheart. One of my most favorite, I love how you say post get out. I'm going to start using that. I'll cite you properly. This is one of my favorite postmodern horror movies. Jen is in the middle of this movie that serves as this allegory for racism and classism, right? We know that she's a survivor because she gets to this island and her first thought is, okay, look, boom, I just got to make it. I just got to live. What do I have to do that? But then once we meet her boyfriend, which is really strange because I wasn't even sure that was her boyfriend. When Lucas first came up, I thought that he and Mia were together because they seemed to show a lot more solidarity than they were willing to extend to Jen. And so once we meet them, we understand that her life, even before the island, was about survival. She was literally having to survive blackness and her black life with her boyfriend, who not only was a white guy, but he also was of means. Pretty much kind of told her, I own your life. We don't believe anything that you say anyway. And of course, you're struck with the thought, why do people get in relationships with people they don't even like? But okay, whatever, you're on this island now. You should try to like her now because there's just 3 of you here. But Lucas tries to control Jen in so many ways. He says he runs her life. He tells her in a really striking part where he kind of says, you have this black cloud always hanging over your head. And I'm thinking, she's black? Yeah, that sounds about right. And so we see that she's not really truly loved by Lucas. And it seems that her role as his lover is more as an object, more as a possession or something that he wants to have possession of. So, okay, there's that. And then there's Carola from the 1990 version of Tales from the Dark Side, the Lover's Vow segment. Rae Dawn Chong played the lovelorn gargoyle, and in gargoyle form, her power, she was able to live as a human. Like, all she had to do was extract this promise from this guy, right? She says, you promise never to tell anybody about this. He says, okay. And then boom, she gets to be this beautiful, beautiful woman and have this idyllic life with this same guy, right? So everything is wonderful. Everything is great. Their life is perfect. He's a starving artist. All of a sudden, he's not starving anymore. He's got a beautiful woman and he gets food every day. He can pay his rent. People are buying his art. And then he messes up and he decides to tell the love of his life the secret that he's been keeping all this time. Well, it is this inability to keep this secret that causes Carola's whole life to break apart. I found it kind of daunting that, as powerful a creature as she was, like, she had all this power, but you mean to tell me that a man opening up his mouth just crashed everything? Really? Really? At any rate, this is what undoes their life, and then she has to go back to being a gargoyle with her little gargoyle babies. And yeah, that was interesting. So, Black women as others. Oh, I absolutely love this character, Katrina, in Vamp from 1986, played by Grace Jones. Of course, though, we're looking for more nuance. And one thing, I actually had to read the script to believe what I saw in the movie. She literally had no voice, no spoken words, none, not a one. She only communicated in grunts, animalistic kind of sex kind of noises, eating noises. So that kind of dampened my excitement a little bit for the character, because I thought, okay, man, wait, she's this business owner. She owns this whole strip club. She owns the sexy. Come on, man. And look at, this is Grace Jones. She has no voice, none, no agency at all. Then she also appeared first in White Body Paint, which, you know, can be a little problematic. All right. And then ultimately, again, because she chose the wrong guy, she dies in a sewer, which is not befitting of a queen of vampires. Like, really? But it does kind of track when we go back to that idea of the male gaze and how feminine sexual agency requires punishment of that expression of sexuality. So ultimately, it wasn't just killing a vampire, it was killing the sexy. In Home from 2016, oh, Tia, just as cute as a button, cutest little girl. I really love this character, mostly because she's allowed to be a spoiled, tempestuous little brat. And so many Black girls are not allowed to do that. They just aren't given that freedom. And so Tia has parents who indulge her. Like, she's rotten. I mean, she is like the little kid that's like, no, I'm not doing anything. And her parents are just like, oh, we love her. Okay. And you want this freedom, right? Because as unfortunate as it is, most Black girls are over-sexualized, even in childhood. And according to data from a study that the Georgetown Law Center on Poverty and Equality did, Black girls are viewed to be much less innocent and adult-like than white girls. And this is especially in the age range of 5 to 14. So little Black girls aren't really allowed to be little kids. They're often seen as adult and sexualized well before they should be. So Tia was kind of a really good thing to see on screen for a change. And then we have Spell from 2020. This is a movie that I don't think gets nearly as much buzz as it should have. But we meet Eloise here as a religious leader. So she is a hoodoo leader in this movie. And we see her here. She looks like any typical Southern grandma. She looks like my great Medea used to look, right? Graying, flipped hair,
But Eloise is not the sweet Southern grandma. She is very cunning. She's also very much smarter than she appears, which is very important. So we think about Black depictions in horror, and most of the time these are urban. And so as a Southern Black person, I was really excited to see a depiction of a Southern Black woman in this movie. And so she speaks with the Southern drawl, but there's nothing comforting or mammy-like about Eloise. Eloise is not to be played with, and she is really, really pretty serious about that whole, killing people and taking their, soul stuff. She's really serious about that. So what is the relevance of this? We could talk all day about these things, but why is this important? Well, it's really important because of this idea of the oppositional gaze. As a lifelong horror fan, and not just purely anecdotal, I was looking for statistics that I couldn't find for this talk, and you would think I'd have them already, right? But Black women are fans of horror. Go figure. Who'd have thought? And so the idea of seeing oneself reflected in media is very important, because some viewers will turn out that gaze. They will shut it off because they do not see themselves reflected. And then the watching of this media becomes a sort of an oppositional activity, where we're looking because we know you don't want us to look, and I want to look, but it's still a painful gaze because I don't see myself or my experiences therein. Back in last month, Jason Parham wrote for Wired that visibility doesn't necessarily equate to progress. A recent UCLA study found that while Black, Latinx, and Asian people were approaching proportionate representation as the leads on cable and streaming scripted shows during the 2019-2020 TV season, can't talk. Their numbers were still shamefully scant as writers, directors, and showrunners. Representation isn't just about having one mirror, but many. And so these experiences, these Black feminine experiences, are not a monolith. They don't exist as just one kind of an experience, just one kind of an enactment. There are quite a few experiences of Black femininity that fit so well into horror, unfortunately. 60% of Black girls have experienced sexual abuse at the hands of Black men before they turn 18. The Human Rights Campaign reports the deaths of 21 transgender women in 2015, 19 in 2016, 29 in 2017, and as of the reporting, 22 in 2018, all through violent means. According to the CDC, in 2011 and 2012, Black women died during pregnancy, childbirth, and the year immediately following childbirth at nearly 4 times the rate of white women. These are horrific realities for Black women. And this isn't a plea to parade this trauma across the screens. The idea is that these things happen and people need to know. We should engage with these things so that we can help to fix these disparities. So moving forward, well, I have some questions. Where's the sympathy for the monstrosity imbued onto Black femininity? I personally would love to see more Black female monsters lean into that monstrosity. I understand that doing so before we've actually gotten to a true level of inclusivity will kind of walk the line of a lot of Black critics say, well, why does the Black girl have to be the monster? Well, I mean, because it's hard and somebody got to do it. And if there were true inclusivity, it wouldn't walk the line of demonizing the Black woman, right? It would be a horror movie, which is what we're kind of aiming for. And at what point can marginalized communities embrace these horrors and find true representation within the genre? We're getting there, very slow. I'm going to tell you all, I'm 50. I've been engaging with horror medium for at least 45 years. It's real slow, real slow. Um, when will Black female horror creators find true inclusivity within the genre? Like, when will we get Black women telling Black women stories? And how do these inherent horrors of residing in marginalized bodies, when do these horrors become worthy of reverence and acknowledgement? So thank you for entertaining me today on this walk. It's like, oh, she's a downer. You can find me usually on Twitter, not writing. I should be writing, but I'm on Twitter. And then, or you can email me if there's any questions, or if you just want to talk about, horror and stuff. Like, I'm game. Thank you so much. As far as in my analyses, there is, because of intersecting identities, Black women issues are the same as Black queer women issues. Like, we're all kind of in the same boat as far as that's concerned. And so one of the biggest things to me was in looking at these statistics for violence against transgendered women. And so I think that I tend to think of the idea of inclusivity, meaning that we have to include the intersecting identities too.
Yeah, in doing my research, because I have such a specific interest in the 1970s, I think homosexuality and queerness is something that is like always present, kind of hidden in a lot of these films. But unfortunately, it's generally treated as a threat, especially if you're dealing with, the 70s and this era where there's such a focus on preserving the Black family, on preserving Black masculinity. And there's just a real fear of it. And it tends to be treated as such a dire threat to preserving Black dignity. But I think there are some really interesting examples. One of my favorite early examples of Black queer filmmaking is Mark of Lilith, 1981. It was previously only available on VHS. The British Film Institute just released it on DVD, I believe, earlier this year. So it's this really interesting student film by this Black lesbian filmmaker about this Black human woman who falls in love with this white vampire. And it's just a story of their relationship and the racial tensions and dynamics that emerge because of it, both because the Black woman is a human and also because of the class and racial differences. So if you're looking for something that's like early, like Black queer horror, I would definitely recommend seeking it out. It's really interesting.
The images that you all showed from telling these narratives, exploring film history. I was wondering if there are any other figures that you discovered along the way that maybe didn't make it into the presentation, but were part of the process.
Oh, for sure. Beloved. Like, I would just say Beloved, the book and the film. Because my poor husband, like, he's always watching me do these things. I'm sitting there with all these slides and I'm going, oh no, I gotta cut some stuff. And so I had to cut Beloved, and oh gosh, this is blasphemy. But this is one of the seminal works. Like, I don't know that you can research, like, Black women in horror without talking about Beloved at all. You kind of have to. It's like it's the Bible, not a Bible, because it means Coleman's book is like the Bible, right? And so, I mean, I couldn't talk about Sethi Suggs as a monstrous mother here, because it would have just taken up like literal so much time. I mean, in my book proposal, it takes up so
so much space. But one of the things is the idea of agency and set the as you know using her agency. Like she had a choice. The choice was let your child grow up and be a slave or kill your child, and she decided to kill her kid. And there's lots of us who kind of go, well, that's no choice. It absolutely was a choice. She exercised the only agency that she had. And so I think that in showing her walk through the guilt in that act, like she feels that she deserves to be haunted. She feels she doesn't deserve to have a man like Paul D. She feels like she doesn't deserve to have a living daughter. And so she basically, that guilt was the manifestation of that haunting by the character Beloved. And so I mean, like, and I could talk about Beloved forever. I'm gonna shut up now. But yeah, that is like one of the biggest things. And it's really interesting to me though that Morrison's work, it wasn't considered horror like for so long. And I'm thinking that that's not because of the horror piece. We totally claimed her from the beginning, right? I think that's more the talk about genre versus literary. But I mean, as far as representation of Black women in horror, there's the mother standpoint. There's also the daughter. Denver was a really big character too. So
For me, I majorly cut True Blood, and I wanted to go into that particularly about because I feel like Lafayette and Tara never really get talked about, and they were part of that as far as like the name of the title. They were the vampire part, and definitely when we talk about um, both of those characters are queer characters as well as magical characters, and they have a journey. It was very lopsided, but I almost take that with a grain of salt because a lot of characters are. But I would have loved to have talked more about Lafayette as not only coming from a different perspective, because we almost never see male priests like that. He was coming into power, like a lot of power. Like he was being able to like defeat a Jed, you know, at that level. And then Tara gained power as a vampire. I would have loved to have touched on literature a lot more because even though I feel in film things are very limited, in literature you have so much and so many different aspects just because you have so much room to talk about hoodoo and conjure as characters. One of my favorite books that I just finished rereading is called Another Good and Loving Blues, and it takes place in Memphis in the 20s, and it's a love story between a conjurer and a blues man over a decade, of them dealing with each other. And the magic is so integrated into the story, it's almost like real life. There's like all this like fantastic. It's by Arthur Flowers. If anyone ever wants to check it out, Another Good and Loving Blues. There's Mama Day, which is another great book. If you like something like practical magic, you have these two aunts that are set. It's set in Bella Country, on one. It's a made up island instead of like St. Helena. It's one of the sea islands on the coast of Georgia, and you have these two aunts that are trying to get their young niece, who they describe as stubborn as a mule the day she came out. They had to like literally pull her out of the womb and trying to hook her up with a boyfriend because they want her to get married. And them interfering in her love life from far away magically is just one of the greatest things. It's just so there. The culture is there. They're talking about grits and biscuits and you know, making sure this child is set right, and it's just normal.
that sounds delightful.
You know, so, literature and True Blood, I would have loved to put that in there.
Two films I cut were Abby, also known as The Black Exorcist, 1974, and Death by Temptation, which are both these really excellent films where the Black woman is this monstrous sex demon figure, who is this huge threat to the men in her life who are trying to escape her grasp and subdue her. which is obviously a very like problematic premise, but it's also something that is kind of fun to revel in. These Black women who use their sexuality as a weapon and find freedom through it. So they're both really interesting, excellent movies.
Yes. Yeah, of course. Had slides about death by temptation. It's like, I'm really excited about what Nia DaCosta is doing. Watching this newest iteration of Candyman was it really felt to me like a love letter to Black people. There was so much nuance in the experiences that were depicted. There were things that showed that it was really written for the Black gaze, because there were things that they would say and do that they just didn't explain. They didn't have to explain it for a Black audience, right? So I'm really excited that now that now that she's proven herself to mainstream, I'm really hoping that she is able to just kind of get a blank check and to see what she can do.
I'm forgetting her first name, but Professor Dew, I believe, who just came out with the horror anthology, Horror Noir.
Tananarive Dew?
Yes.
Yes. Yes, absolutely.
It's streaming on AMC
Mhm.
currently.
Yes.
Incredible anthology. Just absolutely like well researched, well put together. Just incorporates so much elements of Black folklore. There's humor in it. It's amazing. Please go see it.
Yes, it is so wonderful.
I second both of those because the minute I thought of one, you already said it. Not off the top of my head, but definitely Nia DaCosta, and then that's an excellent documentary. It's just so much fun to sit through it, and you just like sit through it with like a notepad. Anything you didn't
Yes.
watch before, you can now go back and like watch and look.
Mhm. Mhm.
Partly answered it already, but I just want to ask the question again. What in the relation to horror does the mother in what way change your mother with the way you look at horror? Can you tell that or
Oh.
was there a change?
Oh, for sure. Watching horror as a kid and growing up, like I could read some. I read Carrie when I was like about 7. I shouldn't have read Carrie when I was 7, but I did. It was available, right? There were so many themes and things that I didn't understand. So, like being a kid is one thing, or even being a young adult is another thing. So, for instance, I read Pet Cemetery, and it scared me so badly the first time I read it. I reread it after I had my kid. And then it was a whole different set of horrors. And what I find is that now I didn't actually come into my own as a horror writer until I had already started having children. And that motherhood experience, all the way from pregnancy and the hormones, not knowing what to do with them, the way that your issues with your own parents come to heal. I'm tending towards a lot of things are very different now, because the things that scared me before, they're not scary at all. And now the thing that scares me is, oh my gosh, is the world going to end before my kids grow up? Or we don't have to worry about zombies. We need to worry about this other thing. And so it really does change my whole approach. And I think that that one of the biggest things about that too is that understanding that moms are not always happy or healthy and are always not able to enjoy that whole experience, with my own health, right? And so it has totally colored everything. I mean, I think in the best possible way, but yeah, way different.
I'm not a mother, but But yeah, I find that in Eve's bio, I was only able to touch on it, but as Eve's eyes start to open with her gift, her life changes and that perspective changes so much because that whole plot runs on what is happening underneath the surface in that family. What's really going on with the father, what's really going on with the mother, even with her relationship with her aunt, who is just a constant widow. She just keeps losing her husband, and what that means, her relationship to her sister. So as Eve is just being initiated into this adulthood, her eyes go from like, oh, this is this. Why isn't daddy home? Why isn't this home? Why, why is mommy in the kitchen doing blah blah blah? And at first, initially, she doesn't understand it. She asks a question like, show me your hands, mommy. Why do you keep cutting your fingers in the kitchen? But she doesn't understand. She's getting a symbolic vision of what's happening. So that interplay with what's going on with her actual powers, her gift, what's actually going on in the family, what's actually going on with herself with these new feelings and having to grow up, and what that means for how she looks at the world. That movie hit me differently watching it as a kid. I thought it was really cool to have a kid protagonist. As an adult, I was like, oh, I get what's going on. Doing this research, I was like, how do I explain all of this layer cake of what's going on? It's so I would say to jump on what you're saying, that my change in perspective has been from as an adult to a kid. That's why I can relate to most.
But there's also the idea that of the mother being kind of the heart of the family, right? Like that whole thing, that's a huge responsibility, man. I mean, and if you're haunted, well then that automatically means that your whole family's haunted. And I don't that level of responsibility brings about a certain fear too, though.
But there's also, like, to jump on what you just said, like cultural fear of, I think, as far as what's going to be depicted in horror movies, who's going to have that, ability to be that very first time depicting a bad black mother. Because culturally, if you're a bad mother, your kids, a bad black mother, you have to prove yourself all the time. Your kids could be taken away from you. Like, you're looking at your kids. You might literally line your kids up before you leave the house to make sure everything is in the right way. And how you depict it, even disciplining your child outside of the home.
Yes.
And what way are you going to do it?
Yes.
Those are constant thoughts.
Yes.
So it'll be really intriguing to see like more bad black moms in horror movies. And if we can do that without like the other side that is policing as far as the culture, like you can't show that.
Sure.
You can't show that. They might think we're bad mothers. And it's like, well, not everybody wants to be a mom 24/7. You can't be. It's impossible.
Right.
You're human. We're all human, but there is, culturally, sometimes you can't be human.
Sure.
And that's the hard. Right?
That is the heart. Exactly. Ding, ding, ding.
Okay.
That's a great question.
Yeah. Me and you just talked about
We
that.
were just talking about it.
I feel like we're at a really interesting point in Black horror to be like discussing this, because we're at a point of such great visibility now. Beforehand, in decades past, Black horror really was just for Black people. We didn't have like the big critics looking in. It wasn't a matter of like winning Academy Awards or anything. And now, when you make movies about trauma, and about like the horrific aspects of the Black experience, there are all these white people who are also watching and are also consuming, and that's like interesting uncharted territory. This is like very much a post Get Out moment, so to speak. I don't honestly have all the answers, but I do think that a core way of navigating that is asking who's in the director's seat, who's producing this, who's writing it, who's in control. And I think that's something we should always be asking when we are consuming media that is Black, like going back to the Blaxploitation question. Like it's Black in name, but is it really Black in substance? I think that's something we always have to be asking ourselves.
For me to answer your question, I think, because like I said, we were just talking about it, of like, like what is horrific, and traditionally, what wouldn't, just as Rhonda just said that, Beloved isn't usually listed as a horror book or a horror story. To us, it is. It's that horrific choice, that Sophie's choice of what do you do with your child in this situation. And it was based on a actual true incident that really happened in Illinois. This woman was escaping with her children, and literally she's at the river about to cross, and she gets caught, and they're breaking into the house. And as they're breaking in, she makes this instant decision to kill. She kills 2 of her children. She doesn't kill the third. She has 3 children. And Toni Morrison finds out about this story, and then it's used as that foundation. And that goes along like Black History Month. Usually you're going to have like 12 Years a Slave. We know all these historical things. It's like, oh, for us, that's actual a horror movie. That's real life. This is something you're going to have to sit down. When do I watch it? How do I watch it? What am I doing the next day? Who am I interacting with? So I can sit down and really process this. Panther, it's like there. And it's so layered. Just the fact that they were walking in that ballroom scene, and each one of them had the way that they're walking in that formation, and the color of their outfits also resembles the Black flag. That's like a layered thing. Like someone else is not going to see it, but we see it. And pointing it out to all these different things. Someone's like, you're going overboard. It's too crazy. It's like, no, they deliberately put it there. So I think it's just going to be this push and pull.
Yeah.
You want to get outs. You want to stay away before we get to everybody.
Yeah, and I think that I agree with both of you. I just published a blog post with Afro Horror Podcast, and I tell you just exactly how I felt. It's my Black trauma, and I'll write it if I want to. As a horror creator, I already feel like there's all these dictates as to what we can and can't write about, right? Or what you can and can't show, what you can and can't do, and it's not just from outside of the Black community, even inside the Black community. You have some gatekeepers who are like, don't you put that on there. That's a bad character. Don't be airing our dirty laundry, right? In public. But as a creator, I want to write in the genre that I love, which is horror. So I'm going to write about stuff that horrifies me. So the one thing I loved about Antebellum, because I know I was like, oh my gosh, I thought this was great. But because of my own experiences as a woman who has, gotten degrees, a woman who has achieved a certain level of, I guess, success as you define it, I perfectly know what it looks like for someone to want to break you down from that. And so to me, that was utterly horrifying that she could have all this success and have made it all this way, and all it takes is for somebody with a penis to just break her down, right? Like, to me, that is horrific. And that was the horror in it. And so I do think that it's really important, as Adia mentioned, though, it depends on the purpose that it's serving and who has control of the images. So I, as having experienced certain traumas, I feel like I have the right to own those. I can write about surviving rape. I can write about surviving abuse. I can write about racism. But I also would handle the topic as not for shock's sake, because that's not the type of horror I write, right? It is for the purpose of showing this is a situation. It would be important to the plot. It would be important to the character. It wouldn't be just gratuitous trauma just for the sake of it being there. And so I will just ditto. We're in very interesting times.
I think it's like, I feel like it's very easy to tell when a creator is using trauma in a way that feels malicious. Also,
Sure.
like,
Oh, absolutely.
like, not to keep bringing up Get Out, but I'm going to do it one more time. There's that one scene at the very end where the cop car pulls up, and you, for a split second, think there's a cop that's going to get out, and it's all going to be over.
Yes.
And then you see it's the friend. And
Yes.
it's that moment of relief, that moment where you kind of, the director knows where your mind is going, because
Yes.
the director is on the same wavelength as you, because the director is Black and is creating for Black people. It's that moment where we don't have to see the trauma go there, because we know it could go there.
Exactly.
And the director knows that we know that. And I feel like that moment of connection is like really what separates, you know, trauma from being malicious versus trauma from saying something important.
Yeah.
Yes, perfect. Yes.
Because just to jump in, I remember watching interviews with Jordan Peele, and he goes into, there's actually 2 cuts of,
Mhm.
you know, Get Out, and thinking, like, sitting there, I'm so glad he made that choice to pull back, because there's a whole nother ending where, you know, there's actually 3, because there's one where, you know, the cops actually show up. There's one where he ends up in jail, and then there's one which is the theatrical cut. And it's amazing how it's so much more effective when you pull back just a little. What you always want to, like, in any filmmaking, any story making, is when it's in that in between, that really towing the line, that tightrope rope walking that we all have. That, oh, that's where all these feelings exist. It's very hard, but
Yeah.
not everyone can be an artist, you know.